this. So I thought I'd do that. So we've been doing the project for about a year and a half now. And I wanted to give a kind of bit of a background to it. So what I thought I would do is, because I wanted to give the stage mostly to Tamsin and her work, because I think it's, you know, particularly relevant to the SRN. But I wanted to give a little bit of background to the origins of the project. I've got a video as well, a little tiny short video that we made as well, but I might try and show that later, but given my technical lack of abilities, I'm going to maybe show that in a bit. So I've always been interested in zines for many years, and zines have got a kind of long history really, and in relation to kind of the MAD movement or the survivor movement particularly, it can become probably dated back to the early mental patients movement. And specifically, let me see if I can move this slide. Can't move the slide going. There we go. So when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I was really interested in, and I studied the birth of the mental patients movement and the mental patients union. And this document on the first slide here is commonly known as the Fish pamphlet or the Fish manifesto, which was created by a few activists, which made the case for a mental patients union in 1971. And that's probably the first kind of survivor organization. And that really is a kind of early zine, in an early MadZine, I would argue, because it's a kind of, in terms of what we consider to be a MadZine, which is something that is critical of the mental health system, that's primarily made by people who have used or survived the mental health system, or have been diagnosed as being diagnosed by psychiatry or mental health services. So in a sense that, and that was, it's actually not an A4, because back in the day, I don't know what they would call it in those days, but it was kind of not the A4 size. It was a different kind of size that paper used to be back in the 70s. And it wasn't called a zine at that point. It was called a kind of pamphlet or a booklet. But in the 60s and 70s, we had a sort of birth really of a radical zine culture. And I would argue that the survivor movement was part of that culture. So this MadZines project has had kind of long history really, because I was researching the mental patients movement back in the late 1980s. And this, as I said, was 1971. And I managed to get a bit of money from the Wellcome Trust to research the first 30 years of Asylum magazine. And that was before this project. And some people might know that I've had a long-standing relationship with Asylum magazine, and I'm now its editor. And I had the fortune of being able to read every single issue of Asylum to look at how the magazine crafted contention about mental health issues. And one of the things I looked at that was around cartoons and pictures and the way in which survivors used different forms of artwork to contest or to send alternative messages about madness and distress and survivorship. I just also wanted to kind of say that there's been a current resurgence of zines, both in terms of kind of collectively produced zines like this one, the Recovery in the Bin zine. I'm sure most of you will know about Recovery in the Bin. It's been going since 2014. And we've seen a resurgence of zines in the current context. And I think that's partly because we've had a resurgence of social movements. So in the 70s, we had a kind of rise of the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, and civil rights movement. And now we're seeing a kind of resurgence of other forms of like neurodiversity, mad pride, trans rights, Me Too, Black Lives Matter. And I think we've seen a kind of co-produced kind of zine culture that's emerged alongside that. And at the same time, we've also had a proliferation of what we call perzines, which are like individually produced zines about people's personal experiences. And I think we've seen more of that recently. I think that's partly because of the impact of the survivor movement. So we've had more consciousness raising around sort of survivorship, but also kind of individualized culture. And also people are more, there's a kind of more awareness around talking about mental health too. So I want to kind of go back to how so when I was doing the research on Asylum magazine, one of the things as I said, I was looking at was how survivors particularly were crafting contention through single panel cartoons. So if you think about comics, they talk about panels. And so a comic strip would have lots of different panels. And Asylum had a number of kind of single panel cartoons like these ones by Tamsin. And we had a special issue of Asylum about 10 years ago now around self-harm and self-injury. And Tamsin was one of the artists who created these single panel cartoons. And I analysed various single panel cartoons created by survivors, including Tamsin's ones about self-injury, for a chapter in this book called Pathographics. And the chapter was called Crafting Contention Through Single Panel Cartoons. And I kind of knew Tamsin and Tamsin's work because of the cartoons, but I hadn't actually had contact with her. And as this project was coming to an end and I was publishing from it, I got increasingly interested in zines, because I was also doing a project about lesbians' experiences of aversion therapy. And I was spending a lot of time with old and early lesbian zines. And I was increasingly kind of sort of interested in how zines functioned as a kind of political form of contention and a personal form of contention too. So to cut a long story short, and with knowing that zines and perzines were experiencing quite a big resurgence, and as I was in the Wellcome library collection where Asylum magazine was deposited, I also noticed they had a growing nascent zine collection that I spent some time with. And there was some fantastic little zines in there that were really crafting contention about madness and distress. So I managed to put together a research proposal for a project specifically looking at MadZines. And I wanted to create a PhD project in that too. And when I published the Pathographics chapter about single panel cartoons, I obviously needed to contact Tamsin to say, is it okay if I use your cartoons? And here's what I've said about them. I didn't want to publish them otherwise, I wanted to check that she was okay with it. And what was great about it was, she said, yes, that's fine if you want to use them. I like how you've used them. And interesting enough, I'm interested in doing a PhD. So when I managed to get the funding for the project, we were able to recruit Tamsin to do the PhD as part of the MadZines project. So it kind of all started to fit together really well. So really I've got loads and loads I could say about this, but I don't want to talk too much because I really wanted to pass on to Tamsin to tell you about the work that she's doing around MadZines and how it's kind of developed, because as you can see, Tamsin is creative and has quite a interesting take on these issues. So before I pass on to Tamsin, I just want to give you some details of where you can find out more about the project if you're interested. So we have a website, madzines.org. We also have a YouTube channel, MadZines Research. We're on Twitter at ZinesMad, and we have Instagram, MadZine Research. We'd be delighted if we don't have many followers really, so we'd be delighted if you could follow us. But without further ado, really, I want to pass on to the main part of this presentation, which is Tamsin, to tell you about the work that she's doing. But I'm happy to answer questions about the MadZines project in general. I think we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I shall stop sharing my screen and Tamsin can hopefully take the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Go with Tamsin.
That's great, thank you. I have got some slides that I want to share just because I've got some pictures. So can you tell me if it's working? Okay, it should work. I have an idea that it will work.
Okay.
Hang on. Oh, sugar, hang on. So predictable, wasn't it, really? Come on, screen sharing. Ah, that's the one. Okay. Okay, is that working?
Yep.
Excellent. And is it actually sharing it as a slide thing?
No, you.
No, yeah.
Yeah? No, because I can't see what you can see. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, Tamsin, yeah.
Great. Okay. Now I can't see what you can see because I've obscured it by putting you on top of it. Right. Okay, we'll just ignore that. Okay. Oh no, I need to go back. Right. Okay, so so from my perspective, Helen emailed me to ask me about the cartoons, and I was dead excited because I really wanted to do a PhD, but I didn't know any academics, and that seems to be quite a good starting point for getting to do a PhD, to at least have an email address. So I emailed her with some ideas, and like she said, it all fitted together really nicely. So that's very exciting. Before I talk, I want to talk a bit about sort of my sort of context and thoughts around sort of survivor research and research, sort of the idea of survivor researching, because it makes me a bit, well, my background is I spent 10 years in services, followed by 10 years working in survivor-led services, about 20 years sort of campaigning in one way or another. You know, originally part of a sort of survivor campaign group. And then I suppose that through my work in survivor-led services, I was sort of, I saw as campaign work. And I've also got like an interest in visual art. So I've done lots of work using sort of visual art and a combination of visual art and text. So those are the three things that brought me to my work: my interest in picture writing, my work around survivors' voices, and the entirety of who I am. So my lived experiences of distress and of being in services, but also my lived experiences of using creativity and my lived experiences of campaigning and working in survivor-led services. And I struggle with calling myself a survivor researcher for three reasons. So one is that in this little picture you can see here, is that fear of being reduced to that single aspect. So that's, this cartoon is about being reduced to only the survivor experience and the rest of everything being kind of ignored. The other reasons are essentially that in my experience that survivor knowledge or knowledge of survivors is devalued in a lot of settings, and you know, I've had quite negative responses to being out as a survivor. So so that's me, and I'll tell you a bit about my research if I can press the right button, which is yes. Okay, so I'll just move this along because I still can't see you. Right. Okay, so my research focuses on survivors' experiences of the process of creating and sharing zines, and how survivor zines might address epistemic injustice. You know, and I'm especially interested in experiences of survivors who are doubly marginalised, so like people who are working class, of colour, things like that. So the questions that I'm focusing on are: how can or do survivors use zines to make sense of their experiences? How can or do survivors use zines to share their knowledge? And sort of what are the strengths and limitations of zines in relation to that process? So I don't know what people's awareness is of epistemic injustice, so I'll just sort of talk through it a little bit. So Fricke describes two types of epistemic injustice. So the first type is testimonial injustice. So the first two images of the weighing scales are my sort of image of testimonial injustice. And she describes it as when prejudicial negative judgments of a person's competence and or sincerity causes us to question or give less credibility to what a person says about their experiences. So it's kind of what tips the balance in terms of whether your testimony is trusted or not. So an example might be when a survivor's account of a service or of their own health isn't trusted because survivors are assumed to be unable to give an accurate account or to be insincere in what they say. And she talks about this in respect of identity especially. So on the little weighing scales you can see, you know, someone, a white middle class male who's never used services might be more trusted in a lot of settings than a working class woman of colour who has used services. So that's my lovely little diagram there. And she describes hermeneutical injustice as injustice that comes from being at a disadvantage in making sense of one's own experiences due to a gap in resources that you might do this with. So she talks about especially shared concepts. So, you know, and about, so an example might be if we look to services to provide concepts or ideas to make sense of our experiences, but the people who've created the concepts don't have the experiences that we've got, they haven't used services, then the concepts available might not be useful to describe our experience. You know, so when we share zines, we share in our testimony, and when we create zines, we're often trying to make sense of our experiences. I think I go on to the next slide now, but I can't remember. Oh yeah, cool. Okay. So Fricke focuses on identity and social power in relation to testimonial injustice and sort of conceptual resources, like in the picture with the head. But I'm interested in sort of some of the other things that affect how our testimony is received. So the different ideas and understanding and perceptions of what it means to be a survivor, and sort of how that varies from in different places, communities, you know, who testimony is shared with and by whom, the process through which our testimony is shared, where and when it's shared, and the form of it. So, you know, the idea of a survivor, so if we look at this, an idea of who is a survivor or what that means and perceptions around that are going to vary, which means that in those different places, our testimony will be responded to differently. You know, I definitely expect my testimony to be discounted, for example, by statutory sector workers if they're aware that I'm a survivor, but not in the sort of social field of survivor peers, you know, and that's based on 20 years experience of sharing testimony in different settings and experimenting with being open or sort of closeted about lived experience. And much of Fricke's work is on spoken testimony, and she doesn't write about form, but you know, survivors, we might share testimony in different ways and using different forms, and then the prejudice against those forms could be described as testimonial injustice, and this might be testimonial injustice that's specifically relevant to survivors. Okay, so there's been loads of great work on restrictions to the narratives that survivors can share. So there's, you know, recovery narratives been described as like a genre where people have to create stories of getting well and overcoming illness. You know, Frank says that narratives of illness need to conform to restitution or quest narratives as a general rule. And Donnelly has written about restrictions about what narratives can be shared based on Western expectations of narrative with a plot, beginning, a middle, and end. So not ongoing. And it doesn't, you know, which effectively silence people who don't fit those narratives, whose experiences don't have like a neat resolution and are ongoing. So yeah, we're expected, like this little story on the right hand side, I'm not sure if it's the right hand side for you, but hopefully, you know, we're expected to tell this nice neat little story, but that might not work to communicate our experience. But more than this, we're often expected to communicate with the language and structure of services. So, you know, we might not experience something as being like plotted temporally, you know, one thing leading to another, but we're expected to structure our testimony in this way. You know, we're expected to use words and sentences to communicate our experiences of madness or distress, you know, but they might not be effective ways of doing this. In my experience, the most accurate testimony that I created about my experiences was testimony that I created using a combination of words and images in quite a kind of chaotic, creative way. And it doesn't, you know, conform to a linear structure, but the structure of the testimony is based on my experience, and the language is based on my experiencing. And this little bit on the bottom left is from some work by Law, where he talks about this expectation that we create sort of singular, definite narratives, so testimony in a particular form and using particular methods. Okay, am I talking really fast, or am I doing okay? Hopefully okay, right. In terms of hermeneutical injustice, I draw on Fricker's definition, but like, I think it's called Kriya, which I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but they basically, Kriya writes about the importance of social contexts when we apply concepts. So that's what this left-hand side of that image is there. So basically, he says that he or she says that we need to consider the negative hermeneutical impact of societal taboos and recognise that it's a hermeneutical resource to have an environment where we can apply and make use of concepts. You know, he points out that where there's a taboo, there can be a social cost to applying the concepts and a personal cost in the form of shame. You know, so like in terms, you know, it might be useful to have concepts like, I don't know, trauma or dissociation, but if we can't actually apply these in our lives, then they're kind of not much more use than a rubber chicken, really, are they? So, you know, and some of these concepts are really difficult to talk about in the sort of wider social environment. I'd argue that the same applies to our internal environment. So that's the image on the right-hand side. Fricker writes about loss of epistemic confidence as being one of the wrongs of epistemic injustice. You know, but if we lose our confidence in our ability to make sense of our experiences, then actually that prevents us from being able to make sense of our experiences. It's paralyzing. So the confidence to make sense of our experiences is a resource that we need. Oh, I've gone too fast. One of the other things that is important in terms of sense making, and this is sort of comes from some of the things that Frick has written, is different spaces in which people create knowledge. So when she focuses more on how people on the process of justice rather than the process of injustice, she talks about like a group of feminists coming up with the term sexual harassment to describe women's experiences of sort of unwanted sexual advances in the workplace. So they've kind of, in this small community, separate from the kind of dominant institutions, they have created their own knowledge, their own concepts, that they can then share with others and make use of. So to understand how epistemic injustice might be addressed, it makes sense to look towards the spaces and processes through which survivors might create their own resources, their own conceptual resources, away from institutions like, well, C.I.C professions, mental health services, or academia. In terms of field work, so I've basically begun by reflecting on my own experiences of creating and sharing zines and other forms of picture writing. And then I interviewed some experienced survivor zinesters about their experiences of making and sharing zines. And I developed a zine-centered method, and then I ran zine making sessions with survivors who were kind of doubly marginalized and interviewed them about the process sort of before, during and after they made and shared their zines. Okay, so it kind of became clear that it was important to develop a zine-centered method in the process of the first year, really. So the methods that need to be suited to the research, these methods are suited to the research in terms of making sense of the kind of complex, messy, intersectional nature of survivor experiences. You know, madness is by definition not uniform or knowable in a routine way. You know, it doesn't stick to conventions or follow rules and expectations. It doesn't stand still. You can't measure it. You know, it's messy. And zines arguably are also messy. And for that reason, they might better represent experiences of madness and other experiences that can't be shoehorned into conventional types of meaning making and structures of communication. So these methods are reflect my research subject, and they honour the messiness and complexity, but they're also a way of honouring survivor zinesters' ways of creating and sharing knowledge. And through these zine methods, I hope to demonstrate and explore zine's potential to generate and communicate new knowledge. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of depth because it could talk about that for a million years and it's a bit boring. Okay. Right. So I'm on really early days in terms of sort of analysis, but I'm going to give you a bit of a taste of where I'm going. So, oh no, sorry. In terms of how survivors can use zines to make sense of their experiences, we can create conceptual resources via zines in 3 ways. So we can do, you can do that in, through and between zines. So here we've got, you can do it through the creative process of making a zine. You can do it through collaborative zine making, and then you can also do it where one zine responds to another, so sort of in the space between zines. And I don't know, I've done that by a straight line. It should really be more of a kind of a network, really. The zine community may provide a social space where survivors can apply concept without a social or personal cost. The form and process of creating zines is flexible, and located away from sort of academia and services and etc. It's accessible to survivors. We don't have to use processes that are not appropriate to making sense of our experiencing. You know, can you imagine if I had to make sense of our experiences by counting them, or producing a single narrative? That feels impossible to me. Having opportunities to structure knowledge in a variety of forms means having opportunities to be creative, to allow the shape of our knowledge to emerge from our sense-making process, to ask different questions about how elements might be linked, to create complex, messy narratives and sense that involves contradictions and doesn't claim to be singular and definite, or even widely applicable. And I would suggest that for those of us whose experiencing of the world isn't linear and implotted, having opportunities to make sense of the world using non-linear, unimploted structures is essential. So, you know, if you don't experience life, you know, A, B, C, D, then why should you have to sort of make sense of it in that way? When sense making via zines, survivors don't have to draw only on words. So we can use different language and structure. So it could be the language of colour, images, layout. It can be a visual language, a word-based language, or a language of structure. And language is more than a vehicle for content. You know, we're often expected to make sense of things using words, but you know, we don't have to. You know, different cultures develop different words according to what's important to them to know and communicate, and in a similar way, different language forms have different capacities to know and communicate different aspects of experience. You know, music and visual language have been credited with having the capacity to articulate emotions that it may be difficult to communicate through words. You know, and as such, they may enable us to know emotions in a way that words can. You know, drawing the body has been suggested to be an effective way to articulate and communicate embodied knowledge, including sort of experiences of pain. You know, and if emotions or pain are the focus of a group's experiencing, then to make sense of and communicate your experiences, you need to be able to make use of language forms that enable you to articulate these experiences. You know, we need to use the be able to use the language that works for us. Oh no, I'll just read that bit. There's some bits missing from my slide. So in terms of sharing knowledge, zines enable survivors to decide what knowledge we can share. You know, you don't have to ask for permission to make a zine. You don't have to be funded by someone else or invited to make a zine. Whereas often survivors get invited by others to share, you know, services or researchers to share testimony, but there are limits on what they're communicate in these spaces, how you can communicate it, when, where, and with whom you communicate it. And when the testimony doesn't fit what's being requested, or where the audience is prejudiced against survivor's testimony, it may be uninvited, excluded, or distrusted. You know, and zines may still be distrusted, but you can't prevent someone from making a zine, so you can't prevent them from creating and sharing their testimony. And they can travel, so they're not restricted to the screen, for example. Because we can make a zine, I said that already. We can make zines on the topic and in the form that we choose. Survivors can use zines as a way to share testimony with other survivors and with a community which welcomes and values testimony that's based on individuals' lived experience in a variety of forms. So you're kind of getting a bit of a sense of where I'm going with this. So in terms of strengths, being created away from mental health services looks like it might be a strength. Having an unfinished DIY quality and no claim for universal truth means that zines can invite a response that they can be added to and the knowledge can be built on between the zines. The sort of social acceptability of talking about mental health in zine spaces means that it may be more possible to share your testimony and to apply concepts to your own mental health. The flexibility in terms of creative process is important. The flexibility of the zine sharing process means that it can be shared in spaces that it might normally be excluded from. Because they're not edited and self-published and they're not expected to be commercial, survivors can decide what testimony to share, the content of the testimony and where they share it. And not having to be physically present and not having to speak makes sharing testimony more accessible for some of us. Like that definitely works better for me. I hate speaking. At the same time, the materiality of zines gives testimony in this form a certain vernacular authority. So it gives it context. The fact you've got this physical object in front of you that you can see, that you can relate to, it's not disconnected from the person that made it, gives it a context. It's not a robot, it's not created by an institution, but by an individual who's invested personal time, energy, and probably money in creating and sharing it. And for that, and that gives it, can give it a sort of certain authority, add to the authority people might give testimony in that form. In terms of negatives, there have been some criticisms of zine culture in terms of exclusivity, inclusivity, maybe around in ways that reflect sort of wider society. You're not going to get powerful institutions valuing zines, at least not anytime soon, and people aren't necessarily going to be sharing interpretations that are helpful. You know, just because they're in zines, we can't necessarily trust them, but then you can kind of, feels like you can run that risk with any knowledge. I feel like I've just rambled inarticulately, but this last image here of the person handing out the zine is basically is what happened when I did the first load of interviews. So I did them online because of COVID, and I thought that my information was just going to be people's sort of stories about the process of making and sharing zines, and then people made it really clear to me that the zines were part of the information, and obviously that was really important because that was the language that they were choosing to communicate in, that was the structure they were choosing to communicate in, and that was a really important part of the whole process. So that's why I had to stick that in on the end. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I think that's possibly me.
Thanks, Tamsin. Yeah, you've had about 25 minutes, but if you want to say any more, that's fine. We have got time.
No, thank you.